Welcome to J Life with Daniel. I'm your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. Today I am here with current council member and Irvine mayor hopeful Tammy Kim. Tammy, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, thank you so much for having me here today.
So we met for coffee a couple weeks ago, and I was reflecting on that with a couple of friends, and I remarked to one of them that you have started to restore the idea of what a progressive is to me. Just taking a little bit of a background, it's not a surprise that the wider Jewish community, especially the pro-Israel Jewish community and the wider progressive political world, have had a very rough time, to say the least, over the last 9 and 10 months. I was just looking earlier, and I don't know if you had a chance to see this. I think this just came out, yesterday afternoon. A federal judge wrote a report basically saying that UCLA was actually forbidding Jewish students to walk onto certain areas of campus. And now there's all this conversation of what UCLA, obviously up in Los Angeles, is going to do to keep Jewish students safe. But I wanted to start at the beginning for people that have never heard of you, that might be surprised that you, a self-identified progressive, are in touch and working together with the Jewish community on a lot of issues. Obviously not probably our views probably don't totally align, which we can get to, but how did you get into this whole mess where your name and ceasefire and Israel and anti-Semitism have sort of been talked about together in a lot of news outlets?
I don't know. Honestly, it's just, we've kind of stumbled on this issue. After October 7th, there was a movement to have city councils call for ceasefires, or having everyone call for a ceasefire. And then I think there was a coordinated effort to get local municipalities to call for ceasefires as first step to maybe some eventual things. And I think the city of Irvine ended up on the front line of this because, we have a mayor and a council member that supported ceasefire initiatives. I think where I really, and I think is a self-proclaimed progressive woman of color, I think there was an expectation that I too also fall in line in terms of calling out for a ceasefire as well. With me, I realized very early on that this was a deeply, deeply complicated issue in an area of the world that I admittedly don't know as much about as other areas of the world. And I felt, because of the fact that Irvine is a very diverse city, that was best for me not to weigh in on anything, because of the complexity and because that is not what the residents of Irvine elected me to do. So therefore, I chose simply not to weigh in. And I think that got misinterpreted in many different ways. And I think that's where it started. But when meeting after meeting happened, and I saw the rise and saw firsthand the acceptability of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic rhetoric, I became concerned, because it really reminded me of, when anti-Asian hate was really prevalent during COVID, and knowing, and that's what it felt like to me, and knowing and being part of that, that's the way it looked to me, and it wasn't right. And I think for me, it was really just a matter of right versus wrong. This is all, I'm giving a Cliff Note version of meeting after meeting, months after months of an observation after observation. But that was the conclusion I came to. And I think that's really where it all sort of spiraled.
Yeah, and we can drill down on city council meetings in a little bit. There was an article in the OC Register talking about how the council members actually needed police escorts in and out of the building. I mean, something that you would never imagine for a town, Irvine, I've been lucky enough to live in Irvine for the last 8 years. I've had plenty of friends and family come and visit me. And Irvine is honestly like, depending on the day, it's either a utopic future or a myopic future. I mean, it's such a small, nice, peaceful city. I mean, I recognize the same people in the grocery store, week after week because, Wholesome Choice and Trader Joe's down the street are, you can run into your neighbors there. And so I was shocked to read that council members, were needing police protection for leaving city council meetings. Is this connected? I mean, there's been an interesting, I think, switch of politics where all politics has sort of come local over the last couple of years. And I think really in two major ways, and really both on the far right and far left, at least in my opinion, you can push back if you disagree. On the right, one of the interesting things that we've been seeing is activists on the far right, going into school board meetings and also city council meetings and trying to push their agenda of either getting certain books removed from schools and, all sorts of things that I think, liberals, and I certainly consider myself a capital L liberal, right? We don't want people running into school board meetings saying which books the public school system is allowed to teach. And then on the left, we saw an injection of foreign policy into city council and also school board meetings. Is this just because of the sort of social mediaification of politics? I mean, why would it even strike an activist really on either side to attend a local city council meeting when it's obviously beyond the power of anybody on any city council to be talking about, aid to a foreign country, regardless of one's opinion?
Yeah, I think again, on the right, you've got the culture wars. On the left, you've got foreign policy. And I think a lot of this is instigated by the legislators themselves, whether it's school board members on the right who were elected to fight some of these culture wars, or in our case, we've got council members who were encouraging people to come out to council meetings. And so in certain cities, they just shut it down right from the get-go. And you didn't see that, and it ended, and then it moved forward. So I think a lot of these things are instigated by the members themselves. And so a lot of these things are local. And I think during COVID, a lot of school board members, they found their footing, I think, during COVID and the masking. And that's where a lot of these, the anti-vaxxers, think that's where a lot of them found their foothold in school board. And then, it started with anti-vaxxing and masking, and then it turned into books and bathrooms and gender sport, and you name it. And so I think that's where it really sparked. And the foreign policy matters. You've got organizations that this was the plan. And you start local and you go at the micro level, if you will, but hoping that it, the bottom up, bottom down, top up approach, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, you also see this on, school city councils, both in colleges, of course, when I was an undergrad at UCLA and now working at UC Irvine, I see it. I mean, even in high schools, I think it's coming to a lot of, student councils in high school where suddenly they're expected to have opinions on, Middle East foreign policy. The interesting thing is it really only is about, Israel Gaza or the Israel-Iranian war, however we want to classify it, right? Obviously, the other big war happening right now that's at least on the radar of people in the West, there are, of course, other wars happening that we scarcely hear about, is Russia-Ukraine, which also has been a big issue within Congress, but that doesn't have the same vitriol, right? I don't believe there are any city council meetings getting disrupted across the country when it comes to, do we continue to fund Ukraine? Are we giving them too much? Are we giving them too little? And all of that. I mean, from your perspective as sort of, a self-proclaimed outsider on this issue, what is it about Israeli-Palestinian conflict that brings about, organizations really on both sides to show up to city council meetings and not just have, okay, we can probably have good dialogue about a real serious issue that is complex, but actually brings people to their darker side and bringing out the vitriol and the personal attacks, and then, compromising even the physical safety of both people who attend and also people on the council. I mean, from your perspective, is this just because of the religious nature? Is it because of the Jewish nature? Is it just because this has been one of the longest conflicts going on in the world?
I think what this really stems from, I think people have a desire for social justice. And I think you see a lot of social justice movements happening at the local level. So for example, whether it's, Black Lives Matter, or whether it's, anti-Asian hate, you've got these things trickling up, and you get people excited and motivated and energized. And I think what's happened is that the pro-Palestinian side has used that sort of social justice framework and applied it to the current situation. And I think one side has been doing a more effective effort on this than the pro-Jewish side. And I think that with this is people want to do the right thing, I believe, and especially on the progressive movement, but they're doing it without really understanding both sides. And I think that's the problem right now. For me growing up, in the time period and in the age, I'm Gen X without revealing my complete age. Gen X, we learned about the Holocaust, and that was part of what we knew. We understood from a progressive standpoint the history of the Jewish American community when it came to workers' rights, civil rights. And that's what we were taught. For whatever reason, we are now at Gen Z. And clearly I haven't been in school, but I don't know what, if anything, has been taught on the Jewish Americans and what their contributions have been in the civil rights movement. And it doesn't sound like there's been much. And instead, you've got the Palestinian side talking about different frameworks that, and then next thing you know, when it comes to Gen Z and millennials, they have a different version of history.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting that you talk about that. And it's something that I talk about a lot. This past year, I actually taught a course on American Jewish history. And, it's been fascinating, delving into a lot of the different archives of, Jewish institutions. And, just to rattle off, I'm sure you know this, but just for listeners, I mean, what probably the most significant event in the early 1900s, right? Hard to drill that down to one, but at least for American Jews, was the immigration shifts in 1924. It's exactly 100 years ago, where America went from having a much more porous border, and that's how, the vast majority of Ashkenazi Jews that ended up in America came between 1880 and World War I. And then due to a whole bunch of anti-immigration sentiment that was also mixed with this sort of America first, also, synthesized with anti-Semitism. And then, of course, there was also a lot of anti-Asian sentiment there also. America voted to restrict immigration much more heavily in 1924, which, for people who understand Jewish history in Europe, was exactly the decade that Jews basically realized that Europe was not going to be safe for the Jewish future. And that basically caused, for at least the last 100 years, Jews in America to vote predominantly Democrat in terms of much more open immigration. Many of the Jews who actually got in before the border closed joined labor unions and, other things like that. And then, of course, feminist movements and civil rights movements. My last podcast, I talked with a George Mason professor who wrote a book about race and Jews, and he's coming at this from a more conservative perspective. And it was interesting talking to him, and what he was talking about. And I wanted to sort of throw this to you just to see your thoughts on this, because I've been thinking about this a lot this past week. The idea of whiteness and who's white and politics that center around identity always seem the goalposts seem to always shift. And so, maybe 100 years ago, Jews were not seen as white and, quote unquote, fully American. But now it seems that for a lot of progressive groups that do tend to want to divide the world by strict identity, Jews have sort of shifted in America from being a minority in need of protection to representative of the sort of whiteness and Americanness that are, actually the oppressors. I wanted to say one other thing, and then I'd love to hear your response. There is a little bit of a tension here, and it's something that I talk about a lot. This is probably not something you could say, but it's something that I can say. There's a bit of a funhouse mirror effect, I think, with the Jewish community, and what you were talking about before with social justice. A lot of people in the left want to map on our, racial identity politics to the Middle East. And so they say, well, Jews are white and Palestinians are people of color, and therefore it's an easy one-to-one. In the American Jewish community, it's true that Jews are predominantly Ashkenazi, so the last 1,000 years in Europe, predominantly overrepresented in the media, in politics, in, the financial industry. They're disproportionately wealthy, right, if you measure household income. But none of that is actually true when we're talking about the Jews in Israel that are predominantly non-Ashkenazi. They're from the Arab world, and they range the whole gamut of, any stereotype somebody might have of Jews. It almost certainly doesn't fit because Israeli population is just a completely different population. So I said a lot. I wanted to throw that to you. Feel free to respond however you want, but just some fodder for conversation.
Yeah, as an Asian, again, Gen Xer, as an Asian American, we typically, Asian Americans, the perspective of Jews is that they're in this minority majority sort of hybrid situation because, with the whiteness, but we also recognize that there's history, language, culture that also surrounds it, whether you're Ashkenazi or, from directly from Israel, that there is a culture that binds everyone together in a very similar way that binds an Asian American, in my case, a Korean American, together. And so it was really interesting to me when I was at council meetings and viewing the Jewish community as having, and I heard this, white privilege. And I never really thought about that because I always viewed Jews as a minority themselves. And so for me, whether I guess your skin color, you are Caucasian, but I always looked at the Jewish community as part of the oppressed and part of that minority status group, along with, whether you're Asian or African American. I just kind of all viewed us all in that sort of same boat, in very many ways.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting. It's funny, this question of Jews and whiteness. I get asked this a lot by Jewish students. I mean, it's such a innocent question, but it's always, for me, representative of a lot of the confusion. I mean, I'll have students call me up and, out of nowhere, I had a conversation with a friend of mine, am I white? And, it's such a funny question for me to answer because there's so much complexity. The way that I tend to describe it, and I'll sort of give both sides, is if a group thinks that whiteness is a good thing in America, Jews are probably not considered white, right? If you talk about white supremacists and neo-Nazis and people sitting around talking about the sort of detriment of the white, class and race, they almost certainly do not love Jews. On the flip side, just to add a little bit of complexity, your average Jew probably does benefit from the general white privilege, especially if I walk around and I am not wearing my kippah, right? I'm probably not going to have the same rates of, say, harassment by law authority as I would if I was a person of color. And so I think like a lot of things, and I like how you opened up with saying that this is too complex to shift into binaries. I think Jewish identity is like that also. It's the question to me of whether or not Jews are white at some point ends up being meaningless, because when a lot of people ask that question from any side, they're trying to simplify Jewish identity, which I think is just way too hard. I don't know if you had anything to add to that before we move on to some other.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you said it best. Yeah.
Awesome. So just one last question on the city council and Israel overlap, and then we'll get to some wider election issues. You're now, 8 or 9 months out from, the post October 7th world, you've obviously been thrusted headfirst, really, as you said before, against your, explicit will into this wider debate. I mean, how has it changed you personally, your views on any issues, what you might do as mayor, just seeing what's been going on the last 8 or 9 months?
Yeah, I really, it's actually quite amazing how my worldview has really shifted in many ways. It really has. And I really feel, as the future mayor of Irvine, God willing, and the voters willing, that, there really is a responsibility in what it is that we do. And the responsibility is so much more greater than just our city alone, but the moral obligation that we have to ensure that our residents are safe, and how that really triggers, and really a reminder of the role that Irvine plays that has within the broader scheme of things, because we are really at the front lines. I knew that if Irvine folded and called for a ceasefire, every single city in Orange County would have fallen as well.
No, I really like that. And just to then bring in the campus component, I mean, for listeners that aren't from Irvine, which, might be some of these listeners, most of them are probably local. UC Irvine's obviously one of, at least in my opinion, one of the shining jewels of Irvine. It's now a universal or a internationally recognized campus. It every year is going up in the rankings. It's expanding. They're building a massive new hospital, really on the border of Irvine and Newport, which, my wife, who is in a medical residency right now, is very excited about that future prospect. So if any future, administrators from the new hospital are listening, you can feel free to reach out to me. I'm, mostly kidding there. This has obviously tackled campus in a way that I think is actually one step more vitriolic than even the city council meetings. And there were a lot of interesting questions that I think mayors were actually faced with this past year when it comes to campus. There was obviously the well-known incident that's been written about in a lot of local media sources, that the current Irvine mayor, Farah Khan, refused to dispatch the Irvine police to UCI's campus to break up the encampment. So they actually had to get sort of a conglomeration of, police, I think mostly from Newport and other districts. I mean, without asking you that specific question, how do you think about the sort of campus element, and what is the role of a mayor of a city to be working with campus? I mean, what happens if there is an encampment, and sort of how would you sort of play this, even more potentially dire and fraught situation?
Yeah, again, when we talk about subject matter jurisdiction, I think it's important for your listeners to understand that the UC system, the UC, whether it's UC Irvine, UCLA, they are their own entity. So that even though they may fall within the city of Irvine or Los Angeles, they're actually governed. The campus itself is governed by the UC Regents, Board of Regents. They have their own system. They have their own police officers. And so, and they have their own governing body. We do not dictate what happens with UCI in the case of Irvine. And so as such, the mayor of Irvine had no right to interject, first of all, on anything, the operation, or to determine what happened there, to usurp basically the chancellor, because the chancellor really is the mayor, if for lack of a better word. And so, and with the mutual agreement with the public safety officers, they have their own public safety. And when they call for mutual assistance, we are obligated to participate. The same way, if we need help, if there's a drone strike, just as an example, or wildfire, that I would hope that Tustin helps us, or Newport, or Lake Forest, whoever are surrounding, Santa Ana, the surrounding neighborhoods, cities come to our defense as well. And so, why she felt that she needed to interject was beyond me. But we do have a moral obligation to ensure that, everyone is safe, and that there aren't hate crimes being perpetrated, which to me, it looked like when Jewish students are walking through encampments and being spit on, to me, that constitutes a hate crime. And so again, it's really complex if you understand how the subject matter jurisdictions work. But bottom line is the mayor had no right to really interject and stop anything from happening. And I thought the chancellor handled it the best that he could.
Got it. Thank you for that. So the election coming up is between you and Larry Agrin. He is also a Democrat. And so for a lot of people that, you know, when we met for coffee, I sort of admitted to myself that this is really the first election that I've deep dived into local politics. You know, I will be totally honest with listeners, for the last election, it was just whichever Democrat was at the top of the ballot for, you know, local elections. I sort of voted down the ballot. And, you know, of course I followed, you know, Congress and the presidential race. But I do think because of a lot of what we're talking about, a lot more people are following local politics and have opinions this year. What would you say are the main policy differences, separate than anything about, you know, the Jewish community in the Middle East, but general policy differences, you know, for somebody that is looking to vote for mayor and just sees that you're a Democrat and he's a Democrat, how would you, you know, state your policy difference?
Well, okay, so policy difference aside, let's first talk about yes, we are both Democrats. I'm the endorsed Democratic candidate. And I think that's the thing that people need to understand. I've been endorsed by the Democratic Party. I've been endorsed by Katie Porter. I've been endorsed by Kati Petri-Norris, Dave Mint, all the Democrats. I'm the endorsed candidate. Planned Parenthood, League of Conservation Voters. So I am the mainstream candidate. My opponent is now the fringe candidate. That's number one. So we'll get that sort of straight. He has decided that he's going to run regardless of whether or not he has the party endorsement. But with that being said, from a policy standpoint, I think that we can see the difference even when it came down to the ceasefire in Gaza and Israel. We could see the policy difference and what you feel that the chamber, the Irvine City Council chamber, and our work should be used for and towards. So we could see that policy difference right then and there. I believe that we are elected to do the work of the city, and therefore we need to focus on the city. I'm not interested in getting into and playing model UN. I'm interested in getting the work of the city done, which we weren't able to do for almost 3 months. I am supportive of affordable housing and making sure that we are promoting efforts to solve our housing emergency, which was evidenced last night when I approved our general plan and master plan update. And he was a no vote. He was the only no vote, which means he is running on a NIMBY campaign. He was also running a campaign or an effort to remove cell towers from our neighborhoods because of hysteria that cell towers cause cancer, which I don't believe in. And so I'm not wearing a tinfoil hat. And, you know, I believe the science and I want to ensure that we are, you know, a modern global city that we can have cell service in our neighborhoods. He has also, you know, run a campaign when I'm trying to make sure that our city is safe by following the rest of the world and ensuring that we have public safety cameras in public spaces such as our parks, our neighborhoods where our residents are expecting them. He called it Big Brother. So these are just some of the policy differences we have. Additionally, he is trying to still put a cemetery in the Great Park, whereas the rest of the world has moved on, and we are putting a cemetery where the veterans want it, which is Gypsum Canyon in Anaheim Hills. But he is still trying to put it at the Great Park in you know, in Irvine, and where the rest of the world is trying to build a park in the Great Park, which includes a 125-acre botanical garden and an amphitheater and a lake feature. and he is still pushing a cemetery. So these are just some of the few differences. I think he is running a platform of 1980s, 1990s campaign, and I'm running a 21st century platform.
And what do you make of, I mean, this question just sort of popped up out of my own curiosity. I mean, who are his constituents? Is he getting, most of the Republican vote? I mean, do you have, polling data out on this? I mean, who would
I
actually
don't
want to vote
I,
for that over, the mainstream Democratic candidate? For Republicans, I imagine they see Democrat, okay, it's a wash. For Democrats, they see, okay, you've been endorsed by basically all these organizations. So why is the race even close, I guess is what I'm asking.
um because he's been around since 1978. So you have the people who've been around since 1978 still with him. And so you still have that. And he still has a fake newspaper called Irvine News and Views that he's pushing out there, that a lot of people don't realize that he has an ownership stake, and his daughter-in-law is the main person or the editor in charge of it, and that he has money funneling through it. People don't realize that, people don't recognize that, and they just think that's a community newspaper. That's it. And so, he still has a mechanism in which he can funnel money through that has been in operation since 1978. And so therefore, we cannot take that for granted. He clearly won his election last time around. So we don't underestimate, I don't underestimate, and I don't minimize that at all. And so I do look at that as something that we need to take seriously. We will still crush it, but we need grassroots efforts in order to crush it, because I can only raise $620 from every person, which I'm running and doing. And so we have nearly 600 donors who've donated to our and contributed to our campaign, which is a record amount. But that's what we need to do in order to beat his machine.
Yeah. So this is a question from an undergraduate UCI student who is a local voter in Irvine. I'm sort of paraphrasing a little bit here. The original question was a full paragraph, but what would you say to somebody who is looking at cities that are run by progressives, San Francisco, Portland, Los Angeles, and sees that a lot of progressive city managing and policies actually do make the streets less safe and, raise homelessness and everything like that? I mean, how might you respond to somebody seeing videos of what's happening, one city over in Los Angeles, and says, well, no matter what, I don't want Irvine to end up looking like that? I mean, how do you differentiate that from good policy that actually helps people?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And unfortunately, that's where the rub is. And I'm a very pragmatic person. And I think that's what it comes down to. And I think that's what I've demonstrated since I was elected to the city council in 2020, is I do consider myself a progressive, but I am also very pragmatic as well. And I don't follow labels, and I don't follow what I'm supposed to do based on whatever those labels are. Yes, I do consider myself a progressive, but I look at the data, I look at the evidence, and I determine what is right for our particular city at a particular moment in time, which is why I've been endorsed by, for example, firefighters who consider me the public safety candidate. I will most likely, and I hope, I can tell you my opponent will not have the endorsement of the Irvine police. And hopefully I will, and I'll wait for that to be announced. And I think that it's because I have a broad coalition because of the pragmatic approach I take. And I take things area by area, subject by subject, and then make a determination. I don't follow labels.
Yeah, I actually got a couple of days ago a pamphlet talking about your election, and it had, in big letters, endorsed by the firefighter in Irvine. It's also interesting. I mean, just self-reflecting as somebody who probably spends way too much time following the Twitterification of national politics. It is really interesting to hear you talk about, a hopeful endorsement by Irvine police. Obviously for somebody that's paying attention to at least the online discussion around progressive versus not progressive, it seems like you would specifically not want the endorsement of the police. So that is really interesting to hear you say. I mean, has that distanced you from other progressives, or am I really just living in this, online bubble where you're really only hearing from, the 1%?
No, you're not, because I think there's this is what the difference is. You've got national issues, and that's what most people pay attention to. And then you've got local issues, and then you've got hyper local issues, and that hyper local is Irvine. And at the end of the day, people come to Irvine, whether you are progressive, you're far left, you're far right, it doesn't matter. You come to Irvine because you want to live in a safe community where you can raise your children. That is it. Because you either grew up here or you want to raise your children here. And that is what we want. We want our access, and we want our piece of the American dream. And part of the American dream is access to safe neighborhoods and safe living conditions. And that's what we all want. And therefore our police are very popular here. And when I get endorsed, and when I go to these endorsement interviews from uber progressive groups saying, will you not take money from the police? Will you reject endorsements of the police? I flat out say, I will accept police endorsement. I am seeking police endorsement. We are not Minneapolis. This is not Oakland. This is Irvine, California. This isn't even Huntington Beach or Santa Ana. This is Irvine. And yes, I do want the endorsement from the police, because I'm working in partnership with the police.
Amazing. So you've been really generous with your time, and I know we're sort of rounding to a close here. Are there any other thoughts, ideas, policy things that you wanted to just address before we let you go?
Yeah, I would leave it at this. I hope I can earn everyone's endorsement, and not just that, and their support, but I need them coming out. I need them supporting our campaign. I need everyone to make sure that we win, because at the end of the day, no one does people do not pay attention. It takes like really super wonky issues, or very high, like these issues that touch people's lives, for them to notice what's happening at the very local level. And we need people paying attention. And even if your friends don't understand who Tammy Kim is and what the mayor of Irvine actually does, I need all your listeners to help educate your friends and your neighbors to say, vote for Tammy Kim, making sure that they don't just, that it doesn't clip off, that they don't vote for president at the top, maybe Congress, and then leave mayor blank. Because that's what happens a lot of times. We need every box filled out. We need to make sure that they go all the way down the ballot, and that they're voting for us and voting for the candidates that I'm supporting as well, across the various districts in Irvine.
And if somebody wanted to help your campaign, either canvassing or donations, what's the best way to connect?
Go to tammykim.com and you will find all your information there. TAMMYKIM.com.
Amazing. Well, Tammy Kim, thank you so much.
Thank you.